When the war ended, silence did not follow. It was replaced by the echo of commands, the scrape of metal against soil, and the trembling breath of women who no longer knew what day it was. They told us to dig holes, and we started to cry, not loud, just the kind of crying that hides in the throat, the kind that mixes with dust until no one can tell if you are weeping or breathing. The sun was pale, almost white, washing everything with a light that felt unreal. Imagine standing there, the shovel's handle rough in your palms, the air thick with the scent of rust and smoke. You hear the sound of the shovel cutting the ground, a rhythm you can't escape. In that moment you understand. The earth is listening, and it remembers. Each motion became a sentence in a story none of us chose to write. The dirt was soft at first, then heavy, clinging to the blade like something alive. You can almost feel the weight of it in your own hands, can't you? The body grows tired before the mind does. The body wants to stop, but the mind whispers, "Keep moving," because to stop would mean to think, and to think would mean to break. The guards' voices came and went like wind, indifferent, mechanical. We didn't look at them anymore. We looked at the ground. We looked at our shadows stretching and shrinking as the day went on. Somewhere in the distance, a river kept moving, carrying away the sound of everything we had lost. You can picture it now, a line of women, backs bent, skin burned by sun and salt. The air hums with insects, with heat, with something unnamed. Every breath tastes of soil. Every blink brings a flash of the world before the war. Streets, laughter, rice fields, faces that feel like someone else's memory. They said the holes were for drainage, for order, for structure. But deep down, we all knew they were graves of a different kind. Graves for the people we used to be, graves for words we'd never say again. The rhythm continued. The sound of shovels striking earth, the sound of breath, the sound of something ancient waiting beneath the surface. If you listen closely, you can almost hear it too. The heartbeat of the ground, slow and patient, older than the war, older than grief itself. When night came, the holes filled with shadows. The air cooled, but the heat stayed trapped beneath our skin. Some women whispered prayers, others simply stared into the dark. The stars above looked indifferent, scattered like shrapnel across the sky. In that silence you could almost believe the earth was breathing through us. And then came the smell of rain. It arrived like a memory, soft, sudden, as if the sky itself had decided to wash the day clean. The first drop struck the exposed soil and made little mouths in the dirt, as if the ground were tasting what we had buried. For a moment the rain felt merciful. It cooled our backs and blurred the edges of the world. You can imagine it now, small cold beads on sunburned skin, on the palms that gripped the shovel until wood met bone. The rain did not apologize. It simply fell, and in falling it made the holes darker, deeper, more secretive. We kept digging. The act became a measure of time, a scale for the days that had lost their names. Morning, the first call of a bell or the bark of a sentry, then shovels. Noon, the sun heavy and brutal, skin blistering, breath shortened. Evening, the slow collapse into sleep with the shape of a hole still echoing under the eyelids. The work organised us like a clock organises hours. The rhythm kept our bodies moving when our minds wanted to stop. There is a strange safety in repetition, a false shelter in routine. You find yourself clinging to it because it is all that remains. Sometimes we thought about what might be under the surface beyond our holes, waste and refuse indeed, but also fragments, a child's toy, a torn photograph, the rusted hinge of a door that once opened to laughter. We imagined these things as small proofs that the world had gone on before and might go on after. When you are ordered to dig without explanation, your imagination becomes a tool as necessary as the shovel. You begin to weave stories into the soil to keep from drowning in the silence. The guards watched. Their eyes, when they landed on us, were brief and clinical, like someone reading labels. They did not look at the faces so much as the actions, cataloguing movements as if each shovel strike should tell them something they could file away. Occasionally one would stand closer, his shadow falling over the fresh earth as if to test its tenderness. We realised quickly that the observation was part of the punishment. being seen and yet having no way to speak of what you were being observed for. Exposure without explanation is a slow method of unmaking. At night, as the rain softened into a constant whisper, some of us lay awake and tried to remember the sound of ordinary things. A train, the chatter of a market, a bicycle bell. These were small sounds, almost shameful in their domesticity. They felt like contraband inside a camp built for the erasure of civilian life. We rehearsed those noises to ourselves like prayers, repeating them until they sounded new. This small rebellion kept us tethered to the self that had not been wholly taken. You will find, when listening, that memory does not behave like a straight line. It folds and doubles. It returns in fragments, in smells, in the sudden flash of a face in a passing puddle. Once, looking into a shallow hole filled with rain, one of us thought she saw her mother's hands. Not clearly, but enough to make the chest ache. The pain was not just for the person imagined. It was a pain for all of the small, unremarkable things that form a life. You carry those things like currency, and when the currency is spent, you count what remains. There were moments of strange beauty among the brutality. The light at dawn, thin and clean, would sometimes lace the edges of the station tents and turn the droplets on grass into miniature hemispheres of glass. The way a bird perched on a barbed wire and looked at us without fear became, for a few seconds, a lesson in small defiance. We noticed these things because our senses had become acute from lack. The harshness of hunger sharpens taste, the cold of night sharpens listening. Attention becomes a survival skill, noticing becomes resistance. We learn to read one another in the way you learn to read weather. Small signs, an attempt at a smile, a hand that pressed a folded sleeve into another's palm, the particular tilt of a head when a memory arrived. These were silently offered gifts. We traded them like letters. No one could speak openly, so communication moved under the surface, in glances and available silences. Wait for the brief pause when a shovel lifts, and in that pause a look can say, "I remember too." That small recognition kept despair from becoming absolute. Sometimes the sky tore open with thunder, and the rain came in sheets, erasing footprints in the mud, erasing the neat rows of folded cloth we kept like relics. After a storm, the air seemed cleaner, as if some small part of the grief had been rinsed away. But the holes remained, and the holes had a stubborn quality. They did not fill up or close simply because the weather changed. They sat like questions propped up in the earth, refusing easy answers. We learned to live with them as one learns to live with a scar. On certain days we were given scraps, an extra handful of rice, a piece of fruit, distributed as if such offerings might make everything right. Those scraps became ceremonies. We passed them quietly, like secrets. Once, sharing a single orange between several of us, the small ceremony of peeling and the scent of citrus felt like a tiny revolution. The flavour hit harder than anything else, sharpness that returned you to a world where flavour mattered. Small pleasures are weapons in places meant to strip you of joy. Sometimes a name would surface in conversation, not aloud but in the mind, and in the small communal interior of thought, someone else would answer it with their own memory. Keiko, Aiko, Yoko, names that belonged to lives that seemed to belong to someone far away. We carried those names like a map to a place we couldn't reach. Saying a name in silence felt like a prayer without a religion, a way to prove you had once been someone rather than a number. The days blurred into months that did not demand calendar marks. Seasons had a peculiar cadence in the camp, wet and dry, then wet again, each shift bringing new work, digging deeper channels, covering more ground, moving stones. The physical demands reshaped bodies and eventually wills. Muscles remembered what the mind could not bear to hold. There is a hard edge to that kind of memory. It is the knowledge that your body can perform the work even when your heart has decided otherwise. We began to dream in the middle of the day, small intrusive reveries that were both a mercy and a torment. A dream of walking down a street lined with cherry trees, a dream of a child handing you a paper crane. The interruption of a guard's shout would snap the dream like a brittle twig, and you would find yourself back with the shovel, hands full of weight. But those dreams were important. They were repositories of a self that refused to dissolve. Even as shells of the past, they were fuel. There were times we believed the digging itself was a ritual for the living, not the dead. In turning the earth, we rearranged our relationship to the past. We took things out of the ground and discovered pieces of lives, bits of cloth, a rusted comb, a fragment of bone perhaps too small to explain. Each object suggested stories, and the mind, starved for narrative, composed them. You invent what you must. The invented stories are not false, they are scaffolding for a reason to continue. When a new order came, always in the form of a single clipped command, the motion of compliance had become automatic, like breathing. But inside that automaticity, something else moved, a small, private revolution of the imagination. You would imagine something outrageously ordinary, a window you could open, a kettle on a stove, a letter delivered and held in hand. These small fantasies decorated the days like hidden mosaics. They were not delusions, they were acts of preservation. In the camp, imagination was a resource. As the block of days accumulated, we began to notice changes in the guards too. Some hardened into silence, others crumbled into a kind of distracted humanity when their routine shifted. On rare occasions, a guard would look away when you expected his gaze. In those seconds, the world widened imperceptibly. The fact that a human could look away was proof that nothing about fate was absolute. It gave us odd, fragile hope. There were losses that could not be named. A woman who fell ill and did not get up, a blanket quietly taken away, a small act of kindness punished without comment. These events accumulated like sediment and began to stratify the memories. You could look at the camp's rows and read, in layers, the story of what had happened there, not with words, but with the density of what had been suffered and what remained. The earth kept those stories, and sometimes delivered shards of them back when storms tore open the surface. In the quiet of an evening, under a sky freckled with new stars, we would imagine the other sides of the world. Houses lit with lamps, trains that moved freely, voices laughing without fear. These imaginings were not naive. They were deliberate acts of contraband, smuggled into the mind to keep a sense of continuity. You cannot survive if you believe the world ended entirely, so you construct it again inside your head, one small, truthful image at a time. When the day finally ended, we covered the tools where we could, stacked the shovels like soldiers laid to rest, and returned to our tents with mud on our feet and dust in our hair. The holes sat like unanswered letters in the ground. They were there to be read by the years. We slept with the sensation of the earth still under our nails and the rhythm of the day echoing in our bones. If you listen, truly listen, you might hear a low, steady sound under everything, the memory of a place that refuses to be erased. The earth remembers what we tried to forget, and in that remembering there is a kind of testimony. The holes we dug were not merely for drainage or waste, they were the first stubborn acts of a history that would not let us go. They kept the shape of our days when names were taken, when schedules were imposed. In the end, the memory in the soil would be proof that once we stood here, that once we dug, that once we refused, by the small means available, to disappear. This is where the first block closes, with the image of the ground holding what we could not carry, and with us, the women, walking away for a moment only to come back, again and again, because the earth, patient as a witness, would not allow us to leave entirely. We left footprints. The rain washed them out. We returned. The holes remained, and so did the quiet, relentless remembrance beneath our feet. They told us to keep our heads down, and still the sky kept watching. Under the same sky, time moved in thin, repeating slices: work, food, quiet, sleep. The camp became a measured room inside a country that felt both too large and impossibly small. You can imagine the day as a metronome, each tick a command, each tock a duty. The metronome kept us precise and small. It also kept us alive. The routine was a machine. You learn a machine's rhythm and the machine becomes a kind of shelter. Wake at the scratch of a horn. Line up. Count. March. Dig. Return. Clean the tools. Mend the cloth. Repeat. There is a strange consolation in the known. The mind can stop doing the heavy work of imagining and let the body follow habit. This is how survival carved itself into muscle and bone. If you listen to that rhythm, you will hear 1,000 small resistances hidden between beats, laughter soft as breath, a finger pressed to a sleeve, a furtive glance toward a distant tree. Those little resistances were the way we kept the self between orders. Under the same sky, we began to notice maps of behaviour. There were women who resisted by quiet non-compliance, by holding a shovel slightly differently, by slowing a step when a guard looked momentarily away. There were others who found different ways, humming under the breath, whistling a tune that passed itself like contraband from lip to lip. The tunes were simple, fragments of songs we had known before. In hearing them, you feel a muscle relax somewhere in your chest. The mind wants pattern. The pattern keeps us human. The camp's edges were a lesson in boundaries. Wire, sentinel posts, the low hum of distant engines marking a frame in which our lives played. Beyond those edges, life carried on. The rivers moved, the markets opened and closed. Children played in towns with names that felt as distant as storybook cities. Inside, we traded for news in whispered formulas. A word, a crumb, an expression that said more than language allowed. Information travelled like a hidden river beneath the camp, who had a relative come by, who had seen the sunrise on a certain hill, who remembered the sound of rain like a code of safety. These small economies of knowledge were crucial. They functioned like maps in an otherwise featureless territory. You begin to care for the smallest things. A spoon becomes a talisman. A strip of fabric is a map back to a bed you once slept in. When the camp offered a scrap of orange peel, the scent of citrus turned into a currency of feeling. You close your eyes and let that scent be a brief exile, an exile that returns you to a seat at a table that might not exist anymore, to a hand that might never reach for yours again. The mind performs these small pilgrimages privately because the world outside does not allow for public pilgrimage. Here, work turned into narrative. Digging was not merely physical labour, it became a way of telling a story without words. The line of holes described a chronology of endurance. The places where the ground resisted more told us about what had been there long before the camp. Sometimes, a shovel would strike a hard kernel, ceramic, bone, metal, and for a moment, the present trembled against the past. Those moments were both cruel and clarifying. They forced the imagination to make neighbour with grief, to name the missing, to account for the weight of what had been lost. Care emerged as a quiet architecture. People who had been strangers before the war learned how to tend wounds, how to fold a blanket with an intention that resembled prayer. A hand learning to bandage another's palm carried history and gentleness in it. You learn quickly that doing small things for someone is to say without speech that they matter. In the camp, performing care was an act of preservation for both giver and receiver. The giver reaffirmed an inner story. I am still someone who can offer care. The receiver accepted the story back. Hunger reshapes thought. When the body is hungry, the mind runs on a thin fuel. Memory narrows and sharpens. It becomes urgent to recall where food used to be plentiful, how rice tasted cooked in a home pot versus how it tasted handed in a thin portion under a tent. Hunger also creates ceremonies out of distribution, eyes cast down when food is given, a sharing of a ration that turns into a confessional. These rituals are major forms of resistance because they preserve the communal life that hunger attempts to atomize. We developed languages of look and pause. A certain tilt of the head meant, I will watch your back today. A folded sleeve placed on a bench in a particular manner signified, take this, it is for you. In a place where speech could be observed and punished, the body learned to speak with grammar of its own. That grammar became complex, precise, and utterly human. When listening to a narrative of these days, note how communication evolves not out of convenience, but necessity, and how necessity births language as craft. Under the same sky, grief had its seasons. There were days when grief arrived in loud volcanic bursts, a woman collapsing and not rising, a child's memory returning like a physical blow. Other days it came as fog, softening edges until nothing held its previous shape. Both were dangerous. The volcanic grief could topple a community, the fog could dissolve it quietly. We learned to name and to not name. Sometimes naming was too exposing, sometimes naming was essential. The politics of memory determined what could be said and what had to be carried silently. The guards were variable. Some were complacent, some actively cruel, and some, in rare moments, appeared tired in a way that resembled an unspoken kinship. There was a contradictory intimacy in occupying the same air with people who, moments earlier, had been strangers, and who now wielded the power to decide minor fortunes. A bowl more rice, an extra ration, a spared blanket. Watching the guard become human, even by accident, felt like seeing a crack in inevitability. Those cracks mattered. They allowed a kind of bargaining, not in words but in the small gestures that could be coaxed from a distracted watchman. Workshops and barter systems grew within the constraints, a clandestine repair shop for shoes, a place where cloth was rewoven into stronger garments, an exchange of lessons. One woman teaching another how to mend a seam in exchange for a story about a hometown. These improvised economies were not merely practical, they were a refusal to be reduced to need alone. They affirmed that each woman had skills to offer, histories to share, and identities that extended beyond prisoner status. We cultivated memory in micro-rituals. There were mourning liturgies, a silent greeting to those who had gone, a pressing of fingers against a photograph tucked inside a sleeve, the folding of a scrap of paper into a bird that would be kept until trade could convert it into something tangible. These small rites passed from person to person, carried like contraband hope. Their effect was accumulative. The practice of ritualical remembering accumulated into a communal structure that resisted forgetting. Bodies changed, hands thickened, fingers nicked and callus-bound, shoulders hunched from the work. Some faces grew thin and sharp, others plumped with the aid of occasional extra portions. The physical alteration continued to affect identity. When you look at a hand reshaped by labour, you begin to understand how labour rewrites story. The body becomes an index of the life endured. In a narrated account, the description of hands tells as much as any detailed memory of home. You begin to observe small miracles, unexpected kindness that arrives without ceremony. A guard leaving an extra piece of bread out of habit, a woman sharing a strip of cloth because she remembers a sister somewhere who once needed it. These gestures are not huge in the arithmetic of suffering, but they alter atmosphere. They refocus attention from what is taken to what persists. The listener who follows this narrative closely can feel these shifts like light through a thin curtain. The seasons taught unusual lessons. The wet season softened the soil, making digging easier, but bringing illness with its humidity. The dry season hardened the earth and made work brutal, but kept some diseases at bay. With each weather shift came adjustments in routine and mood. Weather in this place was not simply environment. It was agent, conjuncture, and sometimes an ally. We learned to watch the sky for meaning the way sailors watch stars, looking for signs that might change the next day's labour. At twilight, when the day's motion slackened and people settled to recover, stories circulated in careful hush. They were not grand epics, but tiny narratives of home. How a neighbour used to laugh, where to find the freshest green onions, the exact feeling of cold water in a river at dawn. These stories were not merely nostalgia, they were instruction. They taught the younger ones how to orient themselves in a world that had grown unknown. Transmitting this small knowledge became a sacred service. Forms of protest existed that rarely looked like confrontation. You resist by patching a garment better, by teaching someone to read a letter hidden in a seam, by whispering a name back to life. These acts were invisible to those who expected spectacle. They were powerful because they were invisible. They preserved interior sovereignty. The listener should notice this pattern. The greatest rebellions often wear the shape of ordinary care. There was also an economy of silence. Silence can protect, but it can also be imposed. We learned when to silence ourselves to protect others, and when to refuse silence because it would mean complicity with harm. The ethics of silence became a subject of tacit debate, negotiated without formal language. The choices were hard: speak and risk retribution, or remain silent and let something die a quiet death. That calculus was different each day. Children, when they appeared among us, rewired the camp's gravity. Even the idea of a child, real or rumoured, changed the way adults curved their attentions. Babies make necessity intimate. They force adults to make future plans even in the present shortage. The presence of a child reoriented priorities and revealed a capacity for generosity that defied the camp's design to atomize life into solitary survival. We started to collect names again, aloud in private. A whispered roll call of the remembered. Mothers, sisters, lovers, neighbours. Naming was an act of defiance because names anchor persons to continuity. The more names we pronounced, the more stubbornly we refused to be reduced. In this narrated account, the recurrence of names becomes a chorus, soft, persistent, unafraid in the end. Medical care was minimal and improvisational. The women who had been nurses before the war repurposed their skills with scarce materials. A strip of cloth became a bandage, a hot stone became a compress. These improvisations were life-sustaining and carried a dignity that formal medicine sometimes hides. The dignity of making do with care when institutions are absent. There is a particular intimacy in nursing wounds with hands that have also dug the holes. You feel the contour of shared labour in every touch. Under the same sky, we learn to make small rebellions beautiful. A patchwork mended into a pattern, a braid of hair tied with a strip of bright fabric. These acts claimed taste, aesthetics, and identity within constraint. There is dignity in arranging the world to reflect beauty, even when the world is designed to erase it. The listener should feel these gestures like bright embroidery stitched onto a grey shirt. Stories change with proximity. The closer a woman stood to loss, the more precise her memory, the farther, the more mythic it became. This is not a flaw, it is how memory organises itself to be bearable. The narrator who traces this truth invites the listener to accept complexity. That recollection can be both exact and symbolic, that truth is not simply the past, but the way the past continues to breathe in the present. Occasionally, orders shifted. We were redirected from digging to clearing, from clearing to rebuilding, always under the same sky. Each reassignment rearranged the day and tested endurance. Adaptation becomes not merely survival, but an art, the art of reassigning hope to different tasks. You learn that hope is not a single object, but a capacity to reorient, again and again, towards small goals. We noticed the land itself changing under us. The repeated labour altered drainage patterns, shifted small slopes, exposed stones where none had seemed to be. It was as if the camp's work was writing a new topography, a topography that would remain after we left or after we did not. The earth takes what is done upon it and keeps a record. That record is patient and stubborn. It outlasts orders and memory alike. By then, the language of the camp had thickened with metaphor. We spoke of hunger as winter, of fatigue as erosion, of hope as a seed. The metaphors were functional. They helped us share understanding quickly and bond emotionally. The listener should pay attention. The metaphors of the oppressed not only describe, but also prescribe ways of being together. Small rebellions sometimes spiraled into larger ones. A withheld report here, a secret exchange there, and suddenly a pattern emerged that could not be simply policed. Authority in the camp was built on predictability, and unpredictability, however small, was corrosive. The guards' attempts to restore order revealed their own fear of the unpredictable human spirit. In that fear, we found leverage. At the centre of all of this was an evolving question: what do we owe one another when the world strips rolls away? The answer in those days was practical and radical. Everything. We owed one another food when possible, warmth, the recounting of names, the retelling of little truths. We owed the preservation of each other's memory. This economy of obligation became the glue that held small communities together. Toward the end of this period under the same sky, rituals became more deliberate. We scheduled small remembrances, inconspicuous gatherings where the telling of a single story would have the effect of rekindling a larger communal tapestry. These gatherings were short and secretive, but they had power. Their concentrated attention reanimated faded details and made history feel alive again. The listener should imagine the intimacy of such moments. A handful of women, huddled, breath visible in the air, each story a thread being sewn back into a garment nearly threadbare. And so the second block closes with an understanding that beneath the same sky we were not merely surviving. In small, persistent acts we were reassembling personhood. The work, the exchange, the rituals, the language of care, all these were slow, patient methods of rebuilding what the war had tried to dismantle. The earth remembered, the sky observed, And we, under both, learned to be human to one another again. When the digging stopped, the silence felt wrong. After so many days, silence had weight. It pressed against the ribs like water. For the first time, the ground lay still, and we did not know what to do with our hands. The shovels leaned against the fence, rust already growing where our sweat had touched the metal. Around us, the air hung heavy with memory, the kind that clings to the lungs and makes each breath sound borrowed. The war was over, they said again, as if repetition could make it true. But endings do not come in clean lines. They arrive in fragments, a rumour, a notice, a gate opening 1 inch wider than before. We waited, unsure what waiting meant anymore. Some stood near the holes, staring into them as if answers might rise out of the soil. Others sat quietly, fingers tracing patterns in the dust. The horizon looked no different. The same sky, the same air. Only the orders had changed. Freedom is a strange sound when you've forgotten how to hear it. At first we didn't trust it. The world outside the wire could have been a trap, another version of command. We were told to gather our belongings, but we had none left that felt like ours. The few who could walk helped the weak. Some leaned on shovels as canes. The gates opened slowly, metal groaning like an old throat remembering how to sing. We stepped through one by one, and the wind greeted us with dust. You might think the first instinct would be to run. It wasn't. We walked cautious, as if the earth beneath our feet could still collapse. Every step away from the camp felt both victory and betrayal. Victory because we were leaving. Betrayal because the ground that held our suffering was also the ground that had kept us alive. You learn that survival carries its own kind of guilt. The mind tries to decide who deserves to walk away and who must stay buried in the narrative. Days passed in a blur of relocation and disbelief. We were transported through ruins that once had names, cities flattened into dust, bridges twisted like bones. Everywhere the same grey haze, the same hollow quiet. When the train stopped, we stood again on unfamiliar soil. There were barracks here too, but they were temporary, halfway places for people who no longer fit anywhere. We learned that home is not a place you return to. It's something you rebuild slowly, from the debris of what you carried inside. At night, we dreamed of the holes. In dreams, they filled with water, with faces, with voices calling from below. Sometimes we woke gasping, sure that the ground under us had opened again. It took time to understand that the holes were no longer in the earth. They were in us. They were spaces carved by grief, by endurance, by memory. You cannot fill them with soil. You fill them with story. And so we began to speak, at first quietly. A word here, a sentence there, then with more confidence, as if each word was a stone placed back into a broken wall. We spoke to one another, then to anyone who would listen. We told of the heat, the digging, the silence, the sound of rain on open ground. We described the smell of rust, the taste of fear, the way the sky refused to look away. We learned that naming is not the same as reliving. Naming is reclaiming. Years later, when historians came to ask questions, they brought notebooks and recorders. They wanted dates, numbers, categories. We gave them something else, the rhythm of breath, the colour of the light, the shape of the silence between orders. They wrote it down anyway, perhaps not realising that what we offered was not data, it was the sound of memory turning itself into language. The kind of truth that doesn't fit neatly into archives. Time does not heal, it transforms. The women we became carried the memory in new forms. Gardens, classrooms, the way we touched our children's faces as if to confirm they were real. Some of us planted flowers over the same kind of soil we once dug. Watching them grow felt like listening to an answer whispered through decades. You can almost hear it too, can't you? The faint hum beneath your feet when the wind moves across an open field, the earth remembering itself alive. As the years unfolded, reunions happened in small ways. A letter traced across oceans. A meeting at a station where faces half recognised became whole through tears. We discovered that time had reshaped us, but the connection remained like an invisible thread. You cannot bury what has been shared in suffering. It burrows too deep, becomes root. Each reunion was a ceremony of acknowledgement. I am still here. You are still here. We made it through. We spoke for those who could not, for the ones whose voices never found air again. We spoke because silence had already taken too much. The stories became a bridge between generations. Young faces listened, eyes wide, unsure whether to believe that such darkness had existed. We told them not to believe in darkness, but to believe in endurance, the quiet, stubborn light that flickers even in the deepest holes. Memory has texture. It is not smooth. It catches on small details, the sound of a cup setting on a table, the smell of wet fabric drying in sun, the pattern of clouds on a day you thought you would not live to see. These details become anchors. They remind you that even in places built to erase humanity, humanity found a way to persist. Under the same sky where we once dug, new generations walk. They see nothing of the camp now, just fields and quiet wind. But if you stand there long enough, you can feel something under the surface. Not ghosts, not sorrow, but resonance. A vibration between soil and sky that hums like a heartbeat. The earth does not forget. It carries everything, the weight of loss, the pulse of survival, the echo of every voice that once broke the silence. To listen is to remember. So if you are hearing this now, pause, breathe. Let the sound of your own heartbeat find the rhythm that once guided ours. That rhythm still moves beneath your feet, across oceans, through decades. It asks nothing of you except witness. Because the act of listening is also an act of keeping alive, and this is where the story ends, or rather, where it continues beyond words. We are no longer in the camp. We are in the soil, in the sound of rain returning to a thirsty ground, in the small kindnesses that outlive war. When people ask what happened, tell them, the earth remembers. Tell them we dug holes and we cried. But the holes filled with voices, and the voices became the wind, and the wind carries our story still.